is I think it's important to take the time to actually say what we mean when we say diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because oftentimes we use the terms DEI, DEIJ, JEDI, all of these terms. And I appreciate Brandon also listing out what was meant by each of these terms. And so when I think about diversity, I think it's important to just acknowledge that diversity simply means the presence of difference and variety, right? And it's one of those terms that can be strategically broadened to meet your needs or narrowed to meet your needs. And if you don't specifically say what you mean when you're talking about diversity, oftentimes you can kind of miss the meaning of what you're trying to get at. Going into equity, which Jeanette just pretty much talked about, so I won't talk about it too much, but it's just the idea of like fairness and impartiality. And so identifying the fact that everyone's not starting at the same starting point, and we exist in this system of power dynamics in which certain communities often start at a lower level or at a different level, and that we need different access to resources. And the clearest example I like to give when I'm thinking about equity is when we think about conferences and how we have different pricing for different career levels, right? So you acknowledge that as a student, you may not be able to afford the same amount as someone who has been in their career for a long time. So we figure out what is needed to make sure you have access to this by identifying that you're coming from two different spots. And then finally, inclusion, which I'm going to talk about probably the most today, but it's just the idea of making sure people feel and are welcome within a structure or a larger group. And I think this is important because a lot of times when we think about diversity, we talk about getting people into the room. How are we getting those numbers? But once they're there, if they don't feel included, if they don't feel welcome, if they don't feel like they're a part of the system, then are we actually doing the job? So the definition I like to traditionally use when I'm thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion is just combining those three, but it's just the promotion of impartiality and fairness across differences to ensure that people are and feel welcome within a larger structure. And what you'll find is oftentimes people don't feel welcome. And so I'm a social scientist, and my Ph.D. looked at diversity, inclusion in marine, aquatic, and fishery science. And I interviewed a lot of individuals from different backgrounds, and one of the specific questions I asked them was to tell me about, asked them if they could share their experiences and how they felt like their race or gender influenced that. And skip through this. And I wanted to show one of the quotes that I pulled out. And I think this is just important to kind of talk about the conversation moving forward of, yeah, you want to have groups, and yeah, you want to have access to DEI, but the actual like psychological well-being or how people are doing when we think about these issues. And so this person was reflecting on their career journey, and I was interviewing at a conference, and they said, when I asked about their experience, and they said it was hard and it's tiring. It's like, and I'm tired right now. And even at this conference, I'm uncomfortable, and it's uncomfortable to navigate my entire career, being the only person who looks like me and having to teach people how to talk to me and how to teach people what they can and cannot say in professional settings or even in casual settings. That there's a lot that people think is okay and it's not, and it's exhausting. And the big part I want to kind of highlight is this idea of something being exhausting, but also this idea of being uncomfortable. And Trita kind of talked about this before. And a lot of times when we think about having conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, we talk about, oh, we need to have these uncomfortable conversations, not acknowledging that people exist in uncomfortable spaces every day. Like that's how they navigate their careers in science or in marine science or fisheries or aquatic science, and they're always in this space of being uncomfortable, and how we have to acknowledge that us not being comfortable talking about this is devaluing the fact that this person is always uncomfortable. It's okay for us to not be uncomfortable, but it's okay for them to always not be uncomfortable, but it's not okay for us to always be uncomfortable as scientists. And when I say us, I'm not necessarily talking about Brittany as a Black person in marine science, but as someone who's in academia or in another field. And so one of the things I think is important, and something that I think about a lot as a social scientist, but just in general, is this concept of positionality. And so positionality kind of acknowledges that who we are and how we see the world influences how we interact with other people. And so when I thought about my research, me being a Black woman allowed me access to certain communities that maybe a white woman or a white man may not have access, because of those of my social identities are reflected. But also the importance of taking that time to realize, who am I? How do people see me? And how am I being portrayed to the world? And how does that affect how I'm interacting with other people? And so I always talk about taking the time to understand who you are, whether you're coming from an underrepresented background or not underrepresented background, and taking that time to identify the potential areas of bias or discrimination that exist, maybe not from your actual actions, but just from the social identities that you portray, right? So for example, we talk about like microaggressions are all of these things that come into play. It may not necessarily be intentional, but there are biases that exist, and being upfront and acknowledging that those are some things that need to be addressed. And I think the important part that, and I'll talk more in the questions and answers, but the important part to acknowledge is that, yes, it's important to get people into the room. Yes, it's important to have programs. This is important to increase the diversity. But if we're not accounting for those actual experiences, if we're not accounting for how people navigate these spaces and making sure that we're breaking down the barriers to experiences, not even just the barriers to get them there, the barriers that are actually affecting how they experience these careers every day, then we're not getting to that true inclusion of the DEI part. And I think that's why I think it's always important to break down, what do we mean by diversity? What do we mean by equity? And what do we mean by inclusion? So we can be sure to find those little gaps and address them as we see fit. And so I just kind of want to come in with that from a more of a like psychological well-being point of view to add to the conversation, but I'm happy to chat about DEI altogether.